I never thought my life would come to this, standing in the doorway of my in-laws' mansion, holding a weekend bag, while my husband, Ethan, prepared to leave me behind like an afterthought. Outside, the family's luxury SUV was already packed, idling in the driveway. The air smelled of expensive perfume and sunscreen, the scent of privilege and planned indulgence. Meanwhile, I was being left with a responsibility I never asked for. "You'll take good care of Liliana, right?" Ethan's voice was distant, mechanical. Not a question, a command. Before I could answer, his mother, Susan, cut in, her gaze sharp as glass. "And remember, if anything happens to her, it's on you." I clenched my teeth, biting back the thousand things I wanted to say. What choice did I have? For 3 years I had been married to Ethan, and in those 3 years I had come to understand something undeniable. His family didn't respect me. They tolerated me. To them, I wasn't a partner, a loved one, or even someone worth their concern. I was just the woman Ethan had settled for. I glanced at Liliana, lying still in her bed, her brown eyes wide, unblinking. A tragic, delicate thing. Ethan's younger sister had been bedridden and mute for years, a victim of fate's cruelty. Or at least that's what I had been led to believe. Ethan exhaled sharply, checking his watch. "We're late. Let's go." His father, Richard, barely acknowledged me as he climbed into the car. His presence was quiet but heavy, the kind of authority that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Ethan followed, slamming the car door shut. I caught Susan's last glance before she put on her sunglasses, her lips pursed in the tight, smug way that made my skin crawl. Then, with a final roar of the engine, they were gone. The silence they left behind was thick, stretching through the house like a living thing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the weight of their judgment still lingering. The house was too big, too pristine. Everything about it felt staged, like a luxury hotel where warmth was optional. I turned back to Liliana, expecting another long weekend of tiptoeing around a girl trapped in her own silence. But before I could take a step, something happened that made my entire body freeze. Liliana sat up. Not the sluggish, half-conscious stirrings of someone waking from sleep. No, she moved with intention. Her back straightened, her hands stretched above her head in a lazy morning stretch. Then she turned to me and smiled. Smiled. "All right," she said, her voice light, playful. "Let's get moving." I stumbled back, my hand gripping the doorframe as my heart slammed against my ribs. You can talk?" Liliana laughed, shaking her head. "Of course I can. I can walk too. I just never wanted them to know." Her words hit me like a slap. My mind scrambled for an explanation, trying to stitch together the reality I had known and the impossible truth unfolding in front of me. "You've been faking?" I whispered, still unable to move. Liliana shrugged, completely unbothered. "It's not faking exactly. More like selective disclosure." I blinked. "Selective, Liliana? Everyone thinks you're helpless," she finished for me. "Yeah, that's kind of the point." Her voice, smooth and effortless, felt like a foreign sound in this house. I had spent years watching Susan fuss over her, treating her like fragile glass. I had seen Ethan roll his eyes in irritation whenever she needed assistance. And yet, here she was stretching, smirking, completely unburdened by the role she had been playing. "Why?" I demanded. "Why would you do that?" Liliana's smirk softened into something more thoughtful. "Because it's easier this way. You don't know what it's like growing up in this family. You think they look down on you? Try being the daughter they never wanted." I swallowed, my pulse still racing. They expect me to be a burden. "So I let them believe I am," she continued, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Trust me, it's better than the alternative." I shook my head. This was too much. My whole body felt unsteady, like the floor beneath me had suddenly tilted. "You have a lot of explaining to do." Liliana grinned, standing up with effortless grace. "I know. But first, how do you feel about a trip to Hawaii?" Liliana sat on the floor, cross-legged, folding a t-shirt with practiced ease. The room was still, but my mind was a storm. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the image of the fragile, mute girl I had known with the self-assured woman in front of me. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice still laced with disbelief. "You've been faking this for 2 years? The whole mute and bedridden act?" Liliana looked up, her eyes steady. "Almost 3, actually. I exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the bed for support. Why? Why go through all of that? She sighed, setting the folded shirt aside. Because it was easier. You have no idea what it's like being me in this family. I waited, sensing that she wasn't done. She rubbed a hand over her face, then looked straight at me. Susan isn't my real mom. My birth mother left when I was 5. I barely remember her. But I do remember how different things were before she left. My dad, he used to smile. He used to play with me. And then one day she was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. And Susan took her place. Something in her voice wavered, but she didn't let it crack. She lifted her chin slightly, defiant even in vulnerability. Susan has never let me forget that I'm not hers. Not once. She made sure I felt like an outsider in my own home. I felt a slow, burning anger rise in my chest. I had always known Susan was controlling, cruel even. But this was something else entirely. So what? You decided to play along? To let them think you were helpless? Liliana smirked, tossing a pair of jeans into her open suitcase. Exactly. If they thought I was a burden, they'd ignore me. And they did. The realization hit me like a punch. They just left you like that? She shrugged. They didn't care. I was just a problem to manage. A responsibility they didn't want. So I gave them an easy solution, someone to pity, not someone to control. I swallowed hard. The thought of a young Liliana, isolated in a house filled with people who treated her like an inconvenience, made my stomach twist. But why tell me? Why now? She paused, zipping up the side of her suitcase, then met my gaze. Because you're the only one in this house who has ever treated me like a person. And because, let's be honest, don't you want to see what Ethan and my mother are really up to? Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? Liliana sat back on her heels, arms resting on her knees, and smirked. Let's just say my brother hasn't exactly been faithful. I felt the blood drain from my face. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. That's not possible, I murmured, shaking my head. I mean, Ethan wouldn't, eh? Liliana's smirk faded into something more serious. You know it is. You've suspected it, haven't you? I opened my mouth to argue, to defend my husband. But the words died before they could form. Because she was right. I had suspected. I had seen the signs, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the growing distance. The way he had stopped asking me to visit his parents' house with him. The way he seemed detached. I had ignored it. Convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. That I was overthinking things. But deep down, I had always known something wasn't right. Are you sure? My voice was barely above a whisper. Liliana nodded. 100%. And if you come with me to Hawaii, I'll prove it. I sat there, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Ethan had lied to me. His mother had lied to me. And for years I had let them. Liliana zipped up her suitcase and stood, brushing imaginary dust off her jeans. So, what do you say? I took a deep breath, pushing away the ache in my chest. If I went, I would be walking into something I might not be ready to face. But if I stayed, I would be left in this house, pretending I didn't already know the truth. I lifted my chin and met her gaze. Let's go to Hawaii. Liliana had orchestrated everything down to the last detail. Her real father, a wealthy businessman, had not only booked our flights and a luxury suite at the same resort where Ethan and his family were staying, but he had also pulled a few strings to ensure we had access to everything we needed. My dad may not have been around much, but when he steps in, he makes things happen, Liliana had told me on the plane. That's why I ended up living with Susan for so long. He was constantly traveling for business, and she convinced him that I needed stability. What she really meant was control. But now, it's time to take that control back. By the time we landed in Hawaii, my nerves were stretched thin, anticipation and dread mixing like a dangerous cocktail in my stomach. I wasn't just here to confirm my suspicions, I was here to end things, once and for all. That evening, Liliana and I dressed to kill. She wore a sleek black dress that screamed confidence, while I opted for a deep red number that made me feel like I was walking into battle. Because in a way I was. As we approached the resort's high-end restaurant, Liliana glanced at me and smirked. Showtime. I swallowed hard, scanning the room as we stepped inside. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to focus. And then, there he was. Ethan sitting at a prime corner table, laughing. His mother, Susan, sat beside him, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. And next to Ethan, a woman, young, beautiful. Her hand rested far too comfortably on my husband's arm as she leaned in, whispering something that made him smirk. My fingers curled into fists. I knew it, I muttered under my breath. Liliana placed a hand on my arm. Wait for it. I turned to her, confused, but she merely winked. Then she glanced toward the table where Ethan sat. That's when I saw it. The small, nearly invisible recording device attached to the underside of their table. My breath hitched. You. Liliana grinned. Oh, come on. You didn't think I'd leave this up to chance, did you? She nudged my shoulder playfully. I made sure they'd be seated at that exact table. The maitre d' owes my dad a favor. My heart hammered against my ribs. How long has it been recording? Liliana pulled her phone out of her clutch and tapped the screen. Since they sat down, she whispered. And I think it's about to get good. I turned back toward the table just in time to hear Ethan chuckle. I'll file for divorce soon, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. She won't see it coming. And once it's done, I'll make sure she gets nothing. Susan nodded approvingly, her voice dripping with disdain. Good? She was never good enough for you anyway. Something inside me snapped. Every moment of doubt. Every time I'd question myself, every ounce of pain I had endured. It all condensed into one singular burning rage. Without hesitation, I grabbed my phone, walked straight toward their table, and dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth. The screen lit up as I hit play. Their voices, Ethan's smug confidence, Susan's cold dismissal, rang through the speakers loud and clear. The surrounding tables went silent as heads turned in our direction. Ethan's face drained of color. What the? I tilted my head, my voice colder than I had ever heard it. Surprised? You should be. The restaurant had fallen into stunned silence. Every whispered conversation, every clinking glass, every hushed laugh had ceased the moment Ethan's voice played through the recording. Now, all eyes were on us. Ethan's mistress, no, his mistake, looked between him and me, her expression shifting from confusion to realization to pure, simmering rage. She wasn't shocked that he was married. She was furious that he had just revealed he was planning to discard me like trash. And if he could do that to me, how long before he did the same to her? Wow! She scoffed, pushing back from the table. So that's how you treat the women in your life. Her voice dripped with venom. Real smooth, Ethan. Real smooth. Ethan, still pale, turned to her in desperation. Baby, it's not what it sounds like. She grabbed her purse and stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over. Oh, it definitely is. Have fun explaining this one. I'm out. With that, she spun on her heel and stormed away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I almost wanted to applaud her. Almost. But my focus was on the man sitting in front of me, my soon-to-be ex-husband. Ethan barely had time to process before I leaned in, my voice soft, sweet, and laced with ice. Not anymore, Ethan. We're getting divorced. And I'll make sure you pay for what you've done. Susan, finally snapping out of her stupor, grabbed my arm with a grip so tight it made my skin burn. Now, wait just a minute. We can talk about this. I yanked my arm away so fast she nearly stumbled. Talk? You mean like how you planned to ruin me behind my back? Like how you sat there plotting while I was the last to know? No, Susan. We're past that. Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists on the table as he turned, his wild, desperate gaze landing on Liliana. You can talk? Liliana grinned like a fox who had just walked into a henhouse. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her voice dripping with amusement. Yeah, and I can walk too. Bet you feel real stupid now, huh? His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came out. His mother wasn't faring any better. Susan looked like she had just seen a ghost, her hands trembling in her lap. Then came the whispers. Hotel guests leaned toward each other, murmuring in hushed tones. Some pointed, others pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Staff members hovered near the entrance as darting between us and the chaos we had just unleashed. And then from the corner of my eye I saw them. Security. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy suit approached our table, his expression neutral but firm. Another guard flanked him, arms crossed over his chest. "Sir." The first one addressed Ethan, his voice low and authoritative. "We need you to leave." Ethan's head snapped up. "What? No, you don't understand. This is a misunderstanding. Sir. We're going to have to insist." The second guard took a step closer. Ethan looked around, realizing too late that no one was on his side. His mistress was gone. His mother was frozen in shock. The restaurant patrons were watching, enjoying this spectacle. "I'm not leaving," Ethan barked. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am?" "A man who needs to leave," the first guard replied evenly. Before Ethan could protest again, the two guards grabbed him by the arms, lifting him out of his chair with an ease that would have been comical if the situation weren't so utterly satisfying. He struggled at first, but it was pointless. He was outmatched. As they began hauling him toward the exit, Susan bolted up, finally regaining her voice. "Wait! You can't just throw him out like this. This is harassment. I'll have your jobs for this." The lead guard didn't even spare her a glance. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you leave as well," Susan sputtered, looking around the room as if anyone would come to her aid. But no one did. Even the staff, who had likely endured her entitled behavior for years, simply watched in silence, their expressions carefully neutral. Her lips parted as if to argue, but then she slumped back, defeated, with a sharp glare in my direction. She grabbed her purse and followed as Ethan was dragged out of the restaurant. The doors swung shut behind them. Silence stretched for a beat. Then came the whispers, the not-so-subtle laughter. The cameras lowering as guests turned back to their meals, delighted by the evening's unexpected entertainment. Liliana turned to me, eyes gleaming. "That was fun." I let out a slow, measured breath, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Yeah," I said, a smirk tugging at my lips. "It was." Weeks passed, and with them, the finality of my marriage settled like a long-awaited exhale. The divorce was swift. Ethan, too preoccupied with salvaging his crumbling life, barely put up a fight. My lawyer, armed with the undeniable proof from the recording, ensured I walked away not only free but well compensated. The alimony settlement was hefty, satisfying, and utterly deserved. Liliana, finally breaking free from the chains of her past, moved in with her father. With Susan's manipulative grip severed, she began building the life she was always meant to have. Watching her thrive was one of the most rewarding things I had ever witnessed. As for Ethan, he vanished from my world, and I let him, until one day he came back. It was late in the evening, and I had just finished a long day at work. Life had taken on a new rhythm, peaceful, steady mine. The days of walking on eggshells, of being discarded and underestimated, felt like another lifetime. A sharp knock at the door disrupted my quiet evening. Something about it felt off. Too slow. Too hesitant. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. And there he was. Ethan. I almost didn't recognize him. The man standing on my porch was a shell of who he had once been. Gaunt. I sunk in hollow. His once pristine designer clothes now hung loose on his frame, wrinkled and faded. The arrogance that used to ooze from him had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but desperation. I opened the door just enough to see him clearly, but not enough to invite him in. "Please," he croaked, his voice hoarse, broken. "I lost my job. That girl left me. My mother, she's broke. I have nothing left." He was shaking, whether from exhaustion or humiliation, I didn't care. I studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as the weight of his downfall pressed down on him. This was a man who once held power over me, who thought he could manipulate, discard, and move on. And now, he was nothing. "You have nothing left?" I repeated, tilting my head slightly. "Well, that makes two of us. Because I have nothing left to give you." His lips parted, as if searching for words, an excuse, a plea. But there was nothing left to say. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the door. And then, I closed it in his face. No more second chances. No more being the woman they could use and throw away. This time, I was the one walking away. And I never looked back.